Story 1. Dr. Elijah Carlisle had always prided himself on his skill as a surgeon. The sharpness of his hands, the precision of his incisions, everything about him spoke of a man who lived for the art of saving lives. In the operating room, he was a god. Every scalpel cut was calculated, every stitch placed with the utmost care. No one could deny the brilliance of his technique. But it was after hours, in the solitude of his office, that he started to notice something odd. It began the way most things do, small, insignificant, easy to ignore. At first, it was just a flicker in his peripheral vision. A shadow, perhaps, or a movement, a ripple in the light. Nothing to be concerned about. He had a high-stress job, after all. Surgeons were no strangers to fatigue, to moments of disorientation. But when he would look up, expecting to see an orderly or a nurse passing by, there was nothing. The hallway outside his office remained as still as a tomb. Then came the whispers. It started with an odd sensation during one of his late-night shifts. After a particularly grueling surgery, a complicated heart transplant that had taken hours longer than anticipated, he found himself alone in the post-op ward. The patient was stable, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He sat at his desk, reviewing the patient's vitals, when he heard a voice, a faint, distant murmur that seemed to come from nowhere. He frowned, leaned forward in his chair, and strained to listen. It wasn't the usual hum of the machines, nor the quiet chatter of his colleagues. No, this was different. Elijah, the voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakably clear. He glanced toward the door, expecting to see one of the nurses standing there, but the hallway remained empty. His eyes flicked back to the monitor. Everything appeared normal. No reason for alarm. He brushed it off as exhaustion. But the whispers didn't stop. The first time he saw the figure, it was during a routine procedure. A man in his mid-40s, Michael Raines, had come in with severe internal bleeding from a car accident. Elijah had worked on him for nearly 4 hours, stitching up the damage and stabilizing his condition. He was meticulous in his efforts, as he always was, but something wasn't right. As he closed up the final incision, Elijah saw it. In the reflection of the sterile steel operating table, behind his own reflection, he saw a shadow, a faint outline of a man. It wasn't the reflection of the surgical staff. No, this figure was standing just beyond the glass, staring back at him with wide, hollow eyes. Elijah's hands froze. The figure, clad in blood-stained clothing, just stood there, unmoving, silent. His chest tightened. His heart skipped a beat. He turned quickly, searching the room, but there was no one there. Just the quiet hum of the equipment and the steady drip of the floor. A breath caught in his throat. He told himself it was a trick of the light. He was tired. Too much pressure. It had to be that. But the figure, the eyes, they were so real. Elijah quickly turned back to his patient. He forced himself to concentrate. There was no time to dwell on hallucinations, especially in the middle of an operation. But as he stitched up Michael Raines' abdomen, he could feel the eyes on him. He could almost hear the whispers again, this time clearer than before. "Elijah, help me," the voice pleaded. He froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was Michael's. But Michael was unconscious, his body still under anesthesia. There was no way for him to speak. But the whispers continued. Elijah's hands shook as he finished the procedure, wiping sweat from his brow. When he finally stood up, the figure was gone. There was no sign of anyone, just a silent operating room. But the voice lingered in his mind, echoing in his skull. He knew something was terribly wrong. The next few days were a blur of normal surgery and routine patient care, but the strange occurrences never stopped. In the middle of a procedure, Elijah would feel a cold shiver run down his spine, his heart hammering as the shadows flickered. The whispers grew louder, though no one else seemed to hear them. He saw shadows darting in the corners of his vision, figures standing just outside his line of sight, only to disappear when he turned his head. It wasn't just in the operating room anymore. He began hearing the whispers at home, soft, almost mocking. Sometimes they came in the dead of night, like distant memories returning to haunt him. Sometimes they were clearer, pained, desperate voices of those who had slipped away while he worked tirelessly to save them. He tried to convince himself that it was stress. It had to be. Maybe he was overworked, too many sleepless nights, too many long shifts. But as the days passed, the whispers became more insistent. The figures began to appear more frequently. And then, they started to speak his name. Elijah, you missed me. He turned to find an empty room. Elijah, why did you let me die? He'd never seen the face of the speaker, but he could feel their gaze, sharp and accusing. It was as if they were in the room with him, watching from the corner of his vision. The whispers were no longer just haunting echoes, they were becoming voices of the past. The voices of the people who had died under his care. The realization hit him like a wave. These weren't hallucinations. This wasn't stress-induced madness. These were spirits. He could see the dead, the souls of those whose lives he couldn't save, trapped in limbo, watching him. And now, they were angry. Dr. Elijah Carlisle had always believed that death was part of the job. As a surgeon, he had seen it all, the bloody, chaotic mess of failed procedures, the helplessness of losing a patient despite his best efforts. But death was a concept, something distant, something otherworldly. It wasn't personal. It wasn't supposed to come back. Until it did. A few nights after Michael Rain's surgery, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The whispers had escalated to full-blown voices now, and they came to him not just at night, but throughout the day. They had a distinct tone, soft and pleading, as though they were begging for his attention, for something he could no longer give. He found himself in the hospital late one evening, long after the staff had gone home. The lights flickered above him as he scrolled through patient files, his mind unable to focus on anything but the phantom figures that appeared in the corners of his vision. Then, suddenly, the room grew cold. It was the same temperature as it had always been. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, but the chill in the room was undeniable. Elijah shivered. His breath became visible in the frigid space, a fog of white swirling in the air. He glanced around, heart pounding, expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. But there was no one there. The voices came again, louder this time. Why didn't you save me? The question hit him like a blow to the chest. He clenched his hands into fists, trying to push the growing panic aside. He had done everything he could, hadn't he? The surgeries, the countless hours, the tireless effort to fix what was broken. The guilt had been there before, like an old companion, but it had never felt this heavy. As Elijah stood up, preparing to leave the room, he caught sight of something in the reflection of the large window that separated his office from the hallway. At first, he thought it was just the dim light playing tricks on his eyes. But when he looked again, he saw a figure standing just outside. It was a man, pale and gaunt, his skin stretched tight over his bones. Blood dripped from his hands, staining his hospital gown. Elijah's breath caught in his throat as the figure raised his eyes to meet his own. It was Michael Raines. His heart stopped for a moment. The man had died on the operating table. Elijah had tried everything to save him, but it hadn't been enough. Michael's lips parted, and he mouthed the words Elijah had been dreading, "You failed me." Without thinking, Elijah bolted from the office, rushing into the hallway. But when he looked back, Michael was gone. The hallway was as empty and silent as ever, except for the cold that lingered in the air like a thick fog. Elijah tried to rationalize what had just happened. His heart pounded in his chest, his palms slick with sweat. He had to be going crazy. He couldn't let this consume him. He had a duty to his patients, to his staff. The hospital couldn't lose its best surgeon. He couldn't lose himself. The whispers wouldn't stop. They followed him to the locker room, to his car, to his apartment. Everywhere he went, they were there, like a constant hum at the back of his mind. They were becoming more insistent, more desperate, and they were no longer just voices of the dead. Some were speaking in languages he didn't understand. Others were simply sobbing, their cries so raw that they tore through him like a physical blow. Desperate for answers, Elijah reached out to his old mentor, Dr. Harold Givens. Givens was a legend in the field, a man who had seen it all, from miracle recoveries to the most grotesque medical failures. If anyone could explain what was happening to him, it was Givens. Elijah met Givens in a quiet cafe a few days later. He tried to keep his voice steady as he described the things he had seen. The shadows, the whispers, the dead patients who appeared at the edges of his vision. But the more he spoke, the more Givens' expression shifted. "You think you're seeing ghosts?" Givens asked after a long silence. His voice was calm, but there was something in his eyes, something like fear. "Elijah, what you're describing sounds like something worse than that." "What do you mean?" Elijah's voice wavered. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction. Givens took a deep breath. When a surgeon spends too much time in the operating room, sometimes they start to lose track of what's real. The mind, it's a delicate thing. And sometimes it breaks. It makes us see things that aren't really there. It doesn't make us weak, but it can make us question everything. Elijah clenched his fists. "That's not it. I'm not imagining it. These aren't hallucinations. These are real. I can feel them, touch them." Givens sighed, shaking his head. "What I'm saying, Elijah, is that sometimes, when you bring someone back from the brink of death, the line between life and death blurs. It's not just your mind playing tricks on you. What if you're seeing the ones who didn't make it? The ones who never left?" Elijah stared at him, horrified. "What are you suggesting?" "That maybe you're seeing the souls of those you couldn't save." Givens' voice dropped to a whisper. "And maybe they're angry." Elijah left the cafe feeling heavier than when he entered. Given's words echoed in his mind, but they offered no comfort. He had no answers, only more questions. The whispers were louder than ever, gnawing at his sanity, and his ability to distinguish between the living and the dead was becoming increasingly difficult. That night, as he sat alone in his apartment, Elijah saw the shadows again. This time, they were no longer distant or faint. They crowded around him, pressing in from all sides. He could hear the soft murmur of voices, the cries of the lost. He could feel their presence, like cold fingers brushing against his skin. He rushed to the bathroom, splashing water on his face, trying to shake off the overwhelming sensation of being suffocated. But when he looked up, he saw them. The spirits of his patients were there, standing in the reflection of the bathroom mirror. Their faces were pale and twisted, their eyes empty and accusing. They stared at him with an intensity that made his stomach turn. "Elijah," they whispered in unison, "you left us." The mirror began to crack, the glass splintering as the spirits reached toward him. Their hands pressed against the cold surface, leaving smudges of blood. Elijah recoiled, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned to flee, but the door was locked. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers grew louder and louder. "Elijah, Elijah." He was drowning in their voices, and there was no way out. The days following Elijah's encounter with the spirits of his patients blurred together. Sleep no longer offered him the refuge it once had, as the dead haunted his dreams as much as they did his waking hours. Every time he closed his eyes, the faces of the lost appeared, twisted, contorted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. The worst part was that he couldn't escape them. They lingered just beyond his line of sight, always watching, always waiting. At times, he would feel their cold breath against his skin, like fingers brushing across his cheek, but when he turned, there would be no one there. Only the empty room, the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. He had tried everything to make it stop. More work, more distractions, more alcohol, but nothing worked. The dead would not leave him alone. One night, as Elijah walked home from the hospital, he passed by a darkened alleyway and heard a soft voice calling his name. He froze. The voice was familiar, soft, pleading. "Doctor." He stepped forward cautiously, his heart racing. As he reached the mouth of the alley, he saw her. It was the young woman from his last surgery, Claire Henderson. She had died on the table just 2 days prior, her body slipping away under his scalpel despite his best efforts. He had tried to save her, tried to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. "Claire?" His voice was barely a whisper. She stood at the end of the alley, her eyes vacant but somehow alive. Her clothes were stained with blood, the same crimson that had covered her chest when she died. Her face was as pale as a corpse's, and her hair hung limp around her face. "I didn't make it, Doctor." Claire's voice was barely audible, as if she were speaking through water, but it felt as though it echoed in his mind. "But you knew that already, didn't you?" Elijah took a step back, his throat dry, his legs shaking. He tried to turn and run, but his feet wouldn't move. His entire body seemed frozen in place, locked in place by something beyond his control. The alley stretched longer, and possibly longer, the shadows bending and stretching as Claire took a step toward him. "You didn't save me," she repeated, her voice a low hiss. "No," Elijah said, gasping. "No, Claire, I tried." She shook her head, the gesture so unnatural it sent a jolt of terror through him. "You didn't try hard enough. And now you'll never escape. We won't let you." Suddenly, the walls of the alley began to close in around him. He felt suffocated, as though the space were shrinking by the second, the air thick with the sound of Claire's voice repeating those same words over and over again. "You didn't save me. Stop. Please," Elijah cried out, but it was no use. The walls of the alleyway were now closing in on him, too tight, too oppressive. He felt his chest tightening, his breath quickening. His heart was pounding in his ears. Before the darkness could completely engulf him, Elijah bolted upright, gasping for air. The breaking point. His eyes flew open, and the room was still dark, the same as it had been when he closed them. Sweat soaked his brow. His hands were trembling, his body racked with fear. He had been dreaming, or had he? He reached for his phone beside the bed, checking the time. It was 3:13 a.m. For a moment, he just stared at the screen, unable to move. He was still trapped in the nightmare, and the dead were still calling to him. He could hear them, just beyond his consciousness, their voices low and desperate. It's too late to escape now. He threw the covers off and rushed to the bathroom, splashing cold water on his face in a desperate attempt to shake off the terror that clung to him. The chill of the water did little to calm him, and as he looked up into the mirror, he saw them again. The spirits stood behind him, faint but present, those he had failed, those he had tried to save. Claire was there, her eyes wide and accusing. Others stood behind her, their faces twisted in silent sorrow, their bodies broken. He saw Michael Raines, the man whose death had set this all in motion. He saw the old woman who had died of a heart attack the year before, her face ashen and drained of life. "You failed," they whispered, their voices rising in unison, each word like a lash across his chest. "You failed us." Elijah stepped back, stumbling as his heart began to race. The reflections were not just reflections anymore, they were real. He could see them, touch them. His own image, once clear and sharp, had become distorted, a foggy silhouette that seemed to bleed into the dead. His own face was now just another ghost. He backed away from the mirror, but the shadows followed him, taking form. They were everywhere now, crowding around him, pressing against him. The air became thick with their presence. "Get out," he muttered, unable to think clearly, his mind overwhelmed. "Please, get out." But the shadows did not move. They swirled around him like a vortex of darkness. And then, in a sudden, horrifying moment, they began to speak, not in whispers, but in screams. "You failed. You left us to die. You will never escape." Elijah collapsed to the floor, his hands clutching his ears as the sound became deafening, suffocating him. The days blurred together after that night. Elijah no longer cared about the world outside the hospital. He wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating, wasn't functioning. He drifted from one moment to the next, his body moving mechanically, as though he were living in someone else's nightmare. The dead followed him everywhere, each of them staring, waiting. At times, he swore he could hear them speaking, whispers in the walls, footsteps behind him, voices calling his name. But when he turned, there was nothing there. Just the empty hallways of the hospital, the sterile, clinical surroundings that had once offered him some semblance of safety. He couldn't escape them. Not in his dreams, not in his waking hours. The guilt he had tried to bury was now a raw wound that never healed. The faces of the dead taunted him, reminding him of every failure, every life he couldn't save. But the worst part was that he couldn't even trust himself anymore. How much of what he was seeing was real? How much was his mind breaking under the strain of too many sleepless nights, too many surgeries, too many lives lost? One morning, as Elijah made his way through the hospital corridor, he saw something that made his blood run cold. At the end of the hall stood a figure. The figure of a man he did not recognize, pale, ragged, and gaunt, his face obscured by dark shadows. The man slowly turned toward him, and Elijah's breath caught in his throat. The man opened his mouth, but no words came out. Only a cold, empty silence. But in that silence, Elijah could feel it, something ancient, something terrifying. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at him. Then, the lights in the hallway flickered, and Elijah understood. There was no escape. There never would be. The walls were closing in. Elijah had never felt so trapped in his life. The dead had made it clear they would never leave him alone. Every corner, every hallway was filled with their accusing eyes, their silent, haunting whispers. Even in his own home, where he tried to shut himself away from the world, they were there, just out of sight, waiting. There was no peace. In the dim light of the hospital's morgue, Elijah sat alone at a metal table, the cold of the steel cutting through his thin hospital gown. His thoughts raced as his hands trembled in his lap. The bodies around him were not just patients anymore, they were his tormentors, his accusers. He needed to do something. Anything to make it stop. But how? The idea had come to him slowly, a thought that crawled into his mind like a snake. What if he could bring them all back? What if he could fix what he had broken? If he could somehow reverse the mistakes he made, the lives he lost, perhaps then, the spirits would stop haunting him. His pulse quickened at the thought. He had heard of fringe medical practices, forbidden knowledge whispered about in dark corners of the world. Doctors and scientists who sought to resurrect the dead, to undo the irreversible. Elijah had dismissed these stories as fantasies, as the ramblings of the desperate or the insane. But now, standing in the morgue surrounded by the bodies of those he had failed, the thought felt strangely seductive. He could save them, he had to. For them and for himself. Elijah, don't do this. He froze. The voice came from behind him, soft, gentle, but filled with unmistakable dread. He turned sharply, but no one was there. His reflection in the polished steel of the morgue's cabinet was all he could see, his haggard, exhausted face staring back at him. But in that reflection, he could see them, the dead. Claire, Michael, the old woman from the heart attack. They were all standing just behind him, their expressions twisted, their eyes filled with accusation. Their faces seemed to merge, distort, and then separate again. Their voices filled his mind, their words punctuated with the same chilling refrain. You didn't save us. His stomach churned. They were right. He hadn't saved them. But what if he could? What if there was a way? His mind spun, and in that moment, the hospital around him seemed to shift, the sterile white walls blurring. The air was thick with the stench of formaldehyde and death, yet something else lingered, something heavier, darker. As if the building itself were alive, watching. Elijah's grip tightened on the scalpel in his hand. His fingers were slick with sweat as he prepared the instruments. His thoughts raced, his pulse erratic, but he could feel a sense of purpose driving him forward. He had to act now, before it was too late. Before the dead consumed him entirely. The cold metal of the scalpel gleamed in the faint light, and Elijah placed it carefully on the body in front of him, the body of Claire Henderson. Her death had been the first, the one that had sent him spiraling into this nightmare. He could still feel her eyes on him, watching, waiting for him to fix what he had broken. Elijah, the whisper came again, but this time it wasn't Claire. This time, it was a different voice, a guttural, unnatural sound. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. Nothing. His breath quickened, and he returned his focus to the body, his hand shaking as he made the first incision. Blood, or what was left of it, leaked out, staining the body's chest. The skin was cold, waxy, the body a lifeless shell. But Elijah didn't care. He had to try. He had to bring her back. As he worked, his thoughts clouded, consumed by a singular need. The room around him was dim, but the shadows seemed to move of their own accord. His mind felt detached, as if he were watching himself from the outside, but the horror of what he was doing didn't stop him. His hands moved with precision as he attempted to reconnect the vessels, the organs, an impossible task, yet he felt no hesitation. He could hear the dead whispering around him, urging him on. Don't stop. The temperature in the room dropped. His breath fogged in the air, and a chill crawled up his spine. It felt as though the very walls of the morgue were closing in, the shadows stretching, warping. Suddenly, there was a noise behind him, a soft scrape against the floor. He froze. Turning slowly, his eyes locked on the figure standing at the threshold of the morgue. It was the man, the gaunt figure from before. His face was still hidden in shadow, his form almost indistinguishable from the darkness around him. But this time, Elijah felt something different, a cold certainty, as if the man wasn't just watching but waiting for something to happen. Something far worse. What do you want? Elijah managed to croak, his throat dry, his voice trembling. His hands were still gripped tightly around the scalpel. The figure didn't respond. It simply raised its hand, pointing toward the table where Claire's body lay. Elijah's heart sank as he turned back toward the table. The blood was no longer staining her body. Instead, it was slowly turning black. The air grew thick with the smell of decay. He could see the skin beginning to blister, the tissue rotting before his eyes. His stomach turned violently, and he staggered back from the table. No, this isn't right. But it was too late. The room was now suffocating. Shadows clung to the walls, swirling in erratic patterns. Elijah could hear the whispers of the dead growing louder, more insistent. The dead, the ones he had failed, were no longer content to haunt him. They were angry, furious, and they were closing in. The figure at the door took a step forward, its form becoming clearer, and for the first time, Elijah saw its face, a face that wasn't human at all. Its features were stretched and contorted, its eyes black voids, its mouth a jagged, gaping hole of darkness. You cannot undo what has been done, it rasped, its voice like the screech of metal scraping across glass. Elijah stumbled back, his mind spinning, his vision blurring. The scalpel fell from his hand as he clutched his head, the sound of the spirit screaming filling his ears. And then, in that moment, he realized the truth. He had never been able to save them. They were already gone. And now, they were taking him with them. The last thing Elijah saw before everything went dark was the cold, empty stare of Claire, her broken body lying on the operating table, her eyes wide open, accusing, unblinking. And then, the world swallowed him whole. Story 2. Jason had always found comfort in the mundane. The steady rhythm of life, work, dinner, sleep, kept the world simple, manageable. The little things were all he needed to stay grounded. Every morning, his routine was the same. Coffee, a quick glance at the news, and then he'd stand in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting his tie or fixing a stray hair. It was a habit, one of the few things in his life that offered consistency. But it was on Wednesday morning, just as the sun crept through the blinds, that something changed. Jason wasn't sure when it happened, but he noticed it immediately. The reflection in the bathroom mirror, his reflection, didn't match him. It wasn't like the reflection was out of sync in some vague, dreamlike way. No, this was different. It was as though the version of himself staring back at him had aged years in a matter of seconds. He blinked, then rubbed his eyes, thinking the early morning fog had somehow distorted his vision. But when he looked again, his reflection remained the same. It was subtle at first, a deepening of the lines around his eyes, a gray strand in his hair that wasn't there before. His skin looked thinner, older. It wasn't just a shift, it was as if his reflection had moved ahead, outpacing him, leaving his true self behind. Jason stood frozen, staring at himself. He wondered if he had simply missed something in the mirror before, if it was just a trick of the light, the way his face always seemed more tired in the mornings. But this felt different. This felt real. And it scared him. He leaned forward, his breath fogging up the glass. His reflection followed, still a few steps ahead, as though it were mocking him, aging just that little bit faster. At first, Jason thought it was just stress. He had been working long hours, barely sleeping, juggling the endless demands of his job as an architect. But it was more than that. It wasn't just the mirror. It was how he felt. He had always considered himself healthy, never prone to illness, but now his body felt out of sync. Every step was heavier. His joints ached. He had trouble shaking the feeling that he was somehow deteriorating. By the time he left for work, his mind was racing. The aging mirror wasn't the only thing that bothered him now. His hands, those hands that had always been steady, felt strangely unsteady. A little tremor he couldn't explain. His clothes, which had fit comfortably a few days ago, seemed to hang off him in odd ways, as if he had lost weight overnight. At work, his colleagues barely noticed, or if they did, they didn't comment. But Jason felt it. He felt the stares. And when he caught his reflection in the windows of his office building, he could swear he saw the same thing, the version of him staring back, older and more worn than he remembered. He tried to push it from his mind. He tried to laugh it off. But when he sat at his desk, all he could think about was how, every time he looked into a reflective surface, his reflection seemed to mock him. It wasn't moving the way he was. It was aging faster, as if time was accelerating in that little glass prison. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Every glance at a mirror, at any reflective surface, brought it all back, the aging. His reflection, still so much older than him. He'd look into the glass, and it would smile back at him, twisted, knowing, and somehow far more worn than he had ever felt. By evening, Jason's anxiety had grown into something darker. His hands were slick with sweat as he fumbled with the door to his apartment. The lights were dim, casting long shadows on the walls. As he entered, he immediately moved toward the bathroom. He needed to see it again, to confront it, to know if it was real. He didn't understand why, but the need to check, to confirm, was overwhelming. He switched on the light and stepped up to the mirror. This time, the reflection wasn't just aging, it was subtly different. The face staring back at him seemed familiar, but wrong. His reflection's eyes were not just older, they were weary, as if it had lived years beyond his own experience. The fine lines, the gray hairs, they were exaggerated now. And then, a subtle shift. His reflection smiled, a slow, deliberate curl of its lips that was entirely out of place. Jason stepped back, his pulse hammering in his chest. No, that wasn't him. He hadn't smiled. It wasn't possible. The man in the mirror hadn't just aged, it had become something else. Something unfamiliar. He gripped the edge of the sink, trying to steady his nerves. His reflection continued to smile, its face beginning to show signs of decay, the skin sagging just slightly more with every passing second. It felt alive, as if it were slowly slipping into another version of itself, one that was more real, more present than the one Jason saw in front of him. His heart raced, and with a sense of mounting dread, he stepped away from the mirror. His reflection did not follow. It stayed, smiling, its eyes glinting with an eerie, unnatural awareness. Jason turned and ran out of the bathroom, as if fleeing from a nightmare that was far too real. But in his mind, the thought echoed relentlessly, what if it was real? What if my reflection is aging, and I'm not? The night was long, full of restless tossing and turning. He tried to ignore it, but the growing sense of dread gnawed at him. How could this be happening? He hadn't seen anything like it before. It wasn't possible. No one could age while remaining unchanged. And yet, every time he closed his eyes, the image of the reflection haunted him, the twisted, older version of himself, grinning as if it knew something he didn't. By morning, Jason felt like a different person. His face was flushed, his mind unsettled. The reflection hadn't gone away. It was still there, creeping into every surface, every reflective pain he passed. But what terrified him most wasn't just the way it aged. It was the growing suspicion that it wasn't just a mirror. That whatever this thing was, whatever force was at work here, it was trying to show him something dark, something he couldn't escape. As he left for work, he resolved to confront it. To face whatever was happening, whatever this force was that had attached itself to him. And deep down, buried under layers of disbelief and growing horror, one chilling thought kept pushing to the surface. What if the reflection isn't the one aging? What if it's me? Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something inside him was beginning to crack. The anxiety that gnawed at him the previous night had evolved into a simmering dread that kept him on edge throughout the day. Every reflective surface, be it a window, a glass of water, or even the polished desk at work seemed to hold the same horrifying vision of his reflection, aging faster than he was. It wasn't just the lines on his face or the graying hairs. It was deeper, more insidious. By midday, he noticed a new detail. The reflection, which had once been a mere shadow of his real self, now appeared more independent. There was a subtle shift in its behavior. It moved slightly before he did. In the corner of his eye, he'd see his reflection pause for a moment, staring back at him in that disconcerting smile before it continued. It was as if the mirror version of himself was waiting for him to catch up. Jason tried to ignore it. He focused on his work, on drafting blueprints for a new project, but the nagging sense of being watched never left. He had grown so accustomed to the creeping reflection that it felt like a presence that was no longer tied to the glass. It was as though the reflection had become a separate entity, an ever-present shadow that hung over him. During lunch, he stood before the office's bathroom mirror, his heart racing. He needed to see it again, to confirm that his mind wasn't playing tricks on him. The face that stared back from the mirror was worse than ever. His eyes, had darkened, and the skin around them sagged slightly, as though time had been cruelly accelerating. But there was something new. A faint aura of something dark, something malignant, seemed to swirl around his image. He moved closer, his breath fogging up the glass. The reflection grinned again. This time, it was more of a sneer than a smile. And this time, it wasn't just his face that was aging. The reflection was showing signs of decay, darker under-eye circles, sunken cheeks, and a tinge of gray on the skin that hadn't been there before. Jason stumbled back, the world around him spinning. What the hell was happening? That evening, he arrived home in a daze. His mind couldn't make sense of what was happening, but the sense of dread had only deepened. The thought of looking in any mirror or reflective surface was unbearable, yet it felt like it was unavoidable. The image was stalking him, unseen, but always present. As he opened the door to his apartment, the silence in the hallway seemed oppressive, heavy with a presence that hung just behind his every movement. Jason went straight to the bathroom. He stood in front of the mirror, staring into it for a long time, hoping against hope that things had returned to normal. That he would see his face, unchanged, as it always had been. But the reflection didn't agree. The face looking back at him was more withered now, as though it had aged years in the mere few hours since he'd seen it last. His reflection's skin had taken on a sickly pallor, the gray hair more pronounced. His eyes were sunken deeper, and the smile, no longer an eerie grin but a twisted, malevolent leer, was widening, as though the thing in the glass was reveling in its power over him. A horrible thought struck him. It's getting older. And I'm staying the same. Jason leaned closer to the mirror, his breath shaking. His reflection was not mimicking his every move. No, it was anticipating them, following just a step ahead. It was as if the version in the glass was aware of its superiority, of its ability to pull ahead in time. And that's when the truth hit him. The reflection wasn't aging in a normal way. It was evolving. The moment he had thought of as a mistake or fluke was becoming something else entirely. His reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was something else, something sentient. That night, Jason lay in bed, unable to sleep. The image of his decaying reflection haunted his every thought, every waking moment. He felt a cold chill creep over him, as though the room had suddenly dropped several degrees. The sound of the wind outside howled, scraping against the windows. But it wasn't the wind that unnerved him. It was the low creaking of the wooden floorboards outside his bedroom door. As if someone, or something, was pacing just outside, waiting for him to fall asleep. Jason held his breath, straining his ears to listen. He could hear it now, faint, deliberate footsteps on the floor, as though someone was walking right beside him, pacing back and forth. He bolted upright, his mind racing, his heart hammering against his chest. The footsteps stopped. He could feel the presence of something just beyond the door, just outside his room. What was happening to him? Why was he being stalked like this? Was his reflection somehow alive? Was it waiting to replace him? Without thinking, he leapt from the bed and rushed to the bathroom, his bare feet slapping against the cold floor. He couldn't wait any longer. He had to know what was happening. But when he stepped in front of the mirror, it was worse than before. The reflection was still there, grinning, but it wasn't just aging now. It was changing in front of him, its features contorting, becoming more grotesque with every second. The eyes no longer looked like his. They had become cold, empty voids, staring at him with a predatory intensity. The grin twisted into something far worse, a monstrous version of himself, not just older, but decayed, as though it had existed far beyond him in time. He recoiled, his hands shaking as they pressed against the sink. It's not my reflection anymore, he realized with a horrifying clarity. It's something else. Something pretending to be me. Jason didn't sleep that night. The thoughts were endless, suffocating. He tried to rationalize it. Tried to convince himself it was stress, exhaustion. Maybe it was his mind playing tricks, overworking in the middle of a rough patch in life. But deep down, he knew the truth. The reflection was no longer just a passive image in the glass. It had become something malevolent. Something that was growing stronger, more aware with every passing moment. It was as though it was waiting for him to break, waiting for him to surrender to the fear. But Jason refused to give in. He knew what he had to do. He needed to find out what was happening. He needed to confront it, to understand why his reflection was aging while he remained the same. In the cold silence of his apartment, he finally whispered to the mirror, "What do you want?" And in the reflection, a twisted grin spread across the face of a man who wasn't him. The next morning, Jason stumbled through his routine like a man in a daze. He was half aware, his mind struggling to process the events of the night before. Had he really spoken to his reflection? Was it possible that the thing in the mirror had answered him? The thought made him shiver, but he couldn't afford to be paralyzed by fear. He needed answers, and the only way to get them was to confront this monstrous reflection, the one that seemed to mock him with every change it made, every wrinkle, every ounce of decay. He'd heard rumors. He'd read strange articles about the uncanny phenomenon where the mind sometimes perceives things outside of its control, delusions born from stress, guilt, or trauma. Could that be it? He thought. Could this all be in my head? But something in his gut told him it was real. The reflection was too self-aware, too malicious. It wasn't just an illusion. It was something that existed alongside him, waiting to take his place. Jason took a deep breath and turned on the bathroom light. He knew what he had to do. He wasn't going to let the reflection win. But as he looked into the mirror, what stared back was not what he had expected. The figure in the glass wasn't just grinning anymore. It was standing still, a frozen image of him, its face twisted in grotesque horror. Jason leaned in, pressing his forehead to the glass. The air around him felt thick, heavy with an unnatural presence, suffocating him with its weight. His reflection was still, the eyes empty, lifeless, yet staring right at him. But there was something deeper in those eyes now, something that wasn't there before. A hollow kind of yearning, a dark hunger. This isn't me, Jason thought, panic rising in his chest. This is not my reflection. It's something else. Something worse. He stumbled back, his pulse pounding in his ears. This was not a simple trick of the light. This was not the stress of work or the oddities of his own mind. No, this was something supernatural, something ancient, gnawing at the edges of reality itself. Jason couldn't help but feel that the thing in the mirror was aware of him, aware of the terror it instilled with every flicker of its decaying form. It was like it was waiting for him to break, to give into its horrifying grip. For days now, Jason had avoided mirrors. He refused to look at his reflection, refused to even glance at the polished surfaces around his apartment. But he had to look now. It was the only way to understand what was happening to him. He reached for the glass. His hand hovered just inches from the mirror, his fingers trembling before he finally touched it. The cool surface sent a chill through his skin, and for a moment, nothing happened. There was no change, no movement. But then, the reflection blinked. Jason's breath caught in his throat. He jerked his hand back, his eyes wide with disbelief. He stared at the figure in the mirror. The reflection blinked again. It's alive. It's aware, Jason thought, his mind spiraling. He had never seen anything like it. The reflection wasn't just an image anymore, it was a presence, a force that moved and shifted according to its own will. And it seemed to be watching him. Waiting. The reflection raised a hand. Jason's own hand shot up to his face instinctively. He pressed his palm against his cheek, but the reflection didn't follow. Instead, it moved faster. The image of him in the glass took a step forward, its eyes burning with malice. Jason recoiled, gasping for air. The figure in the mirror was aging faster now, its skin withering like rotting flesh. Its mouth opened, stretching into a grotesque grin that revealed rows of sharp, yellow teeth. Jason's mind snapped. He backed away from the mirror, his legs trembling beneath him. It's taking me, he realized with sickening clarity. It's not just aging, it's replacing me. For the rest of the day, Jason's thoughts were consumed by the reflection. The mirror, once an innocent part of his life, had become a deadly trap, a window to a twisted reality where he was not in control. The idea that his reflection was alive, growing stronger, evolving into something more sinister, consumed him. He tried to tell himself it was just a phase, that it was all a figment of his imagination, but deep down, he knew that wasn't the case. The reflection had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. That night, Jason sat on the edge of his bed, staring into the dim light of his apartment. His hands trembled as he wiped his forehead. His thoughts were a mess, a storm of confusion and fear. The reflection had become something more than just a mirror image. It was a malevolent entity, feeding off his fear, feeding off his very essence. And it was growing stronger by the hour. The clock ticked on, the ticking sound loud in the otherwise silent room. It was 2:15 a.m. when Jason heard it, the faintest whisper. It came from the direction of the bathroom, soft at first, but growing louder as though someone was speaking in a low voice. He froze. His heart pounded against his ribs. The whisper was getting clearer. Jason slowly stood up, his body cold with dread. The whisper was unmistakable now, low and guttural, with an edge of malice. Jason. Jason, it's time. Jason turned toward the bathroom door. It stood there, ominously silent. A chill ran down his spine as he slowly approached, his mind racing with the thought of what lay beyond the door. The reflection, that thing, was waiting for him. It was waiting to take him. The door creaked open, and Jason stepped into the darkness of the bathroom. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the mirror, afraid to make a move. And then, he saw it, the reflection. But this time, it wasn't aging. It was standing still, its grin stretching wider than ever before, its eyes filled with a hunger that Jason could no longer ignore. He could hear his own breath quickening, his pulse pounding. The reflection's hand reached out, its fingers almost brushing against the surface of the glass. And then, the voice came again, clearer than ever. Jason, your time is over. Jason stumbled back, his legs giving way beneath him. He crashed to the floor, his hands gripping his head, trying to shut out the voice. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. But the reflection was there, in front of him, waiting. Jason's heart pounded in his chest like a drum as he lay on the cold, hard bathroom floor. The mirror before him now seemed to pulsate, its surface rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. His mind was racing, every thought splintering and disintegrating in the wake of the nightmare unfolding before him. The voice that had taunted him, "Your time is over," echoed in his skull. He tried to push himself up, his arms shaking with the effort, but every part of him felt like it was made of lead. His body was too heavy, too weak. His reflection, the thing in the mirror, was no longer simply an image. It was an entity, a being that existed in a dimension beyond his own, and now it was reaching out to claim him. "Get up, Jason," he whispered to himself, dragging his hand across the cold tiles. But his body felt foreign, like it didn't belong to him anymore. The reflection in the mirror was no longer just aging, it was deteriorating at an unnatural pace. Its skin had fallen away in patches, revealing bones that seemed to snap and crack as it moved. The eyes, once filled with malice, now glowed with an eerie, unearthly light, as if they were filled with some dark knowledge that Jason couldn't comprehend. The figure's mouth moved again, but this time it wasn't speaking. It was laughing, a low, rasping sound that rattled Jason to his core. He had to stop it. He had to stop the reflection before it took him. Jason stood on unsteady feet, his fingers gripping the sink for support. His breathing came in shallow, uneven gasps. He knew he couldn't keep running from the reflection, from the thing that was slowly pulling him into its nightmare. He had to face it, no matter how terrifying the consequences. He looked into the mirror one final time. The figure in the glass was now grinning at him, its skeletal features twisting into a grotesque mockery of his own face. It was too much to bear. His chest tightened, and the darkness inside him threatened to consume everything he knew. "Why?" Jason choked out, his voice raw. "What do you want from me?" The reflection's smile widened, and it reached out its hand, no longer a reflection, but a beckoning claw, as though it could pull Jason through the mirror itself. Jason's mind reeled. It didn't make sense. He was trapped. His reflection was taking on more and more of his features, his identity. It had been doing this all along, getting closer and closer to becoming a true replica of him. But why was it aging? Why was it rotting, withering, decaying? And then, like a terrible revelation hitting him in the chest, Jason understood. He wasn't looking at his reflection. He was looking at his replacement. The reflection's grin turned cold, cruel. Jason's hands shook as he stepped closer, the air around him growing thick and oppressive. The laughter had stopped, but the silence that followed was even more deafening. The mirror was no longer a mere object. It had become a window to something ancient, something far older than the world he knew. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He was rooted in place, staring at the decaying version of himself in the glass. It wasn't just aging, it was becoming him. Everything Jason had feared was true. The reflection, the aging, the horror, everything he had experienced was building up to this singular moment. Jason looked at the figure's eyes, its hollow stare that mirrored his own. He could feel the weight of time pressing down on him, pressing him toward the inevitable truth. "Take me," Jason whispered, defeated. "Take me. You've won." But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, its bony hand reaching toward him, its mouth twisted into a grin. Jason reached up, trembling. The glass beneath his fingertips was cold, colder than he'd ever felt before. The reflection's eyes flickered, a sign of something ancient waking, something hungry. The air around him vibrated, filling his ears with a low hum. He was being pulled, sucked into that dark abyss. And then, suddenly, the room fell deathly still. A whisper, the voice that had been tormenting him for days, came again, clear and distinct. "You never understood, did you, Jason?" Jason looked at the reflection, wide-eyed, but the figure didn't speak. It just kept smiling, its teeth sharp and unnaturally white against the withered skin. The reflection leaned forward. "You thought you were in control. You thought you could escape. But you're already gone. You always were." The words sank into him, the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Jason was never meant to live beyond that moment. The reflection, this rotting, decaying version of himself, had always been his fate. It had been waiting for him all along, a dark counterpart, growing older, more powerful, while he stayed the same. Jason felt his legs give out. His body collapsed to the floor, and for a moment, he could feel a strange sense of peace. The reflection was no longer just a shadow. It had become his future, his end. But before he could succumb to the darkness, before the world around him could fully dissolve into oblivion, Jason's hand shot up one last time. He reached for the mirror. And then, in a split second, everything changed. Jason's hand pressed against the mirror with a force so strong that the surface of the glass shattered, splintering into jagged shards. He was pulled forward, sucked into the darkness, the light of the room flickering out with the breaking of the glass. But as the darkness swallowed him whole, Jason realized something horrible. He was still staring at the reflection. Only it was no longer aging. It had stopped its decay. It was perfect. unnaturally perfect. And in the fractured glass, Jason saw what he had become. The reflection had won. His last thought, as the world around him twisted and vanished, was simple. This is what happens when the reflection takes over. Story 3. It was the cold that woke her. A sharp, bitter chill creeping in from the window that wasn't quite closed all the way. Her body stiffened as the sensation reached her skin, prickling her nerves and pulling her from a restless slumber. Breathing in deeply, Sarah Groves opened her eyes, blinking at the dull gray light filtering through the curtains. It was early, too early. Her body screamed for more rest, but her mind, still groggy from sleep, was already shifting uneasily. She felt different. Not like when you wake up from a vivid dream, still unsure whether the events were real or imagined. No, this felt far worse. Her muscles ached, sore in places she couldn't immediately identify. As she stretched, reaching her arms above her head, she noticed the sting in her chest. At first, she chalked it up to the odd angle she must have slept in, but as her hands moved to feel the discomfort, she froze. Fingers brushed over the surface of her skin and found an unusual texture, a tenderness, an inflammation. A series of small cuts scattered across her torso like someone had taken a knife to her while she slept. What the hell? Sarah muttered, her voice hushed and strained. Panic began to creep in as she quickly sat up, the sheets rustling as her legs swung over the side of the bed. She ran her fingers over the jagged marks, feeling their raised edges against her fingertips. Her heart thudded in her chest, faster than it should have been. The pain felt real. Too real. For a moment, she considered that it might be the remnants of a nightmare. A dream so vivid that her subconscious had decided to leave her with a scarred memory that bled into the waking world. But this was no dream. The pain was physical. The wounds were real. The memories of the previous night came flooding back, slow and disjointed at first, like trying to recall a distant song from childhood. Sarah's mind fought against the fog of sleep, forcing the fragments of her dreams into sharper focus. There had been a woman, a faceless, ghostly figure who seemed to call to her, beckoning her into some dark, unfamiliar place. The woman's voice was a whisper, barely audible, but Sarah could feel it reverberating in her chest. She remembered her body moving of its own accord, walking down a long corridor. The air had been thick, suffocating, and the shadows in the hallway seemed to curl around her, chasing her forward as if something, or someone, was following. Her hand had reached out, but before she could make contact with the wall, the woman had appeared, her face contorted in a grotesque mask of fear and agony. The woman had pressed her hand to Sarah's chest, and that was when the pain began. It wasn't just pain, it was an intensity, a heat, a feeling of being torn apart, of being hollowed out from within. Sarah had screamed, but the woman only whispered that she was sorry. And then, everything went black. Now, with her body still aching, Sarah couldn't help but wonder if it wasn't a dream at all. The marks, the pain, could they be connected to what happened in her sleep? Could the woman have somehow reached into her world, leaving her with something more than just a memory? Shivering, Sarah stood up, her legs weak beneath her, and walked toward the bathroom. The mirror above the sink caught her eye, and for a brief moment, she froze. Something was wrong. Her reflection didn't seem to match the real her. She looked different. Tired, yes, but there was something else, something colder in the eyes staring back at her. But that wasn't the strange part. It was the cut. There, right across her reflection's neck. A deep gash that wasn't there when she had gotten out of bed. A chill ran down her spine. Her heart fluttered in her chest, and she felt the room close in around her. The reflection in the mirror wasn't just mimicking her. It was alive in a way she hadn't realized before, its own entity, separate from her. And, in that moment, Sarah realized the worst part. The reflection was aging, slowly, almost imperceptibly. But it was happening. The face in the mirror shifted, as if a film of dust had been pulled away from her features. She could see the lines deepening on her reflection's face, the skin becoming paper thin, as though time had suddenly accelerated, like the reflection was caught in a distortion of reality. But when she looked down at her own hands, they were untouched. Her skin was smooth, unmarred by the years that had suddenly crept into the mirror. Her hands trembled as she reached up, touching the cold glass. Her reflection mimicked her, but something in its eyes seemed to twist, as if it knew something Sarah didn't. A sudden, sharp pain shot through her chest, and she gasped, clutching at the wounds there. Her breathing became shallow, each inhale sending another wave of agony through her. "No," she whispered under her breath. "This can't be real." But it was. She could feel it. The blood beneath her skin was pulsing, her heart hammering in her chest. The pain was growing, crawling through her like a parasite. She watched in horror as her reflection began to move differently, jerky and slow, its movements less synchronized with her own. Her reflection reached out, a phantom-like hand coming toward her, but it wasn't a reflection anymore. It was a shadow, a twisted version of herself. She recoiled, slamming the bathroom door shut behind her. Her breath came in short, ragged bursts as she pressed her back against the wood, trying to steady herself. The pain in her chest throbbed with each beat of her heart. And then, as if it had been waiting for this very moment, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from her best friend, Jane. "Sarah, are you okay? I had the weirdest dream about you last night. You were... I don't know how to explain it. You were in trouble. You were bleeding, and I couldn't help you." The message felt like a punch to the gut. There was no way Jane could have known. She hadn't told anyone about the pain or the cuts, let alone the dream. But somehow, Jane had seen it, had felt it. And the worst part was, Sarah had a sinking feeling that the nightmares were far from over. Sarah's heart raced, her mind unraveling with the implications of Jane's message. She stared at her phone, the screen glowing back at her like a silent judge. The words blurred as she blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of it. She was bleeding? That was exactly what she felt, the ache, the bruising, the sting. She had to focus. The reflection, the aging skin, the strange sensation of waking with scars, she couldn't dismiss it as just a bad dream. Something was wrong. Something far worse than she could possibly comprehend. She grabbed her robe from the back of the bathroom door and quickly wrapped it around her, trying to steady herself. She needed to get out of the bathroom, to breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. As she stepped out of the bathroom and into her dimly lit bedroom, she caught her reflection once more in the full-length mirror that hung on the wall. Her reflection hadn't changed since the last time she saw it, but Sarah swore that the dark circles beneath her eyes were deeper now, and the cuts on her chest seemed angrier, more pronounced. They throbbed, pulsing in a steady rhythm with her heart. She reached out to touch the mirror again, her fingertips grazing the cool surface, but this time, she wasn't sure she wanted to make contact. The thought of the reflection moving on its own, shifting away from her, was enough to make her stomach twist with unease. But it wasn't just the reflection that unnerved her. It was the sensation, something pulling at the very fabric of her being, a tether between her waking world and the one that existed behind her eyes, where nightmares lived and breathed. A world where the lines between dream and reality were becoming increasingly blurred. Sarah took a step back, breathing heavily, the air in the room growing thicker. She had to talk to someone. She needed answers. She rushed to her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed Jane's number. The call rang once, twice, and then Jane's voice came through, a touch of concern already evident. "Sarah? What's going on?" "You sound off," Jane said, her voice tight with worry. I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice cracking. "I don't know what's happening to me. I woke up with these cuts, Jane. Like something happened to me while I was asleep. And then, my reflection, it's aging. Like it's not even me anymore. It's moving on its own. And you said you dreamt of me? You saw me bleeding?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Sarah could almost hear Jane's heartbeat, the same unease creeping into her voice. "I had the strangest dream last night," Jane began. "You were there. But it wasn't really you. It was like something was wearing your skin. And you were bleeding, Sarah. You kept reaching out to me, but you couldn't stop the bleeding. It was like your body was falling apart. And then you looked at me with your eyes, but they weren't your eyes, you know? They were cold. Empty." Sarah felt a cold sweat break out across her skin, a shiver crawling down her spine. Jane's words sent a chill through her, confirming her worst fear. This was not just a nightmare. This was real. "I don't know what's happening," Sarah whispered, clutching the phone in her trembling hand. "I don't know how to make it stop. I'm scared, Jane. I think I'm losing myself." Her friend fell silent for a moment, and when she spoke again, there was a cautious, almost fearful note to her voice. "You need to see a doctor, Sarah. Something's wrong. This isn't just in your head. I think you're connected to something. Maybe a thing that doesn't belong in your world." The words hit her like a ton of bricks. A thing that doesn't belong? Her throat tightened, and she glanced back at the mirror. Her reflection was still there, but she swore it looked even older now. Her face was gaunt, the wrinkles deepening with each passing second, the flesh around her eyes drooping. But it wasn't just aging. It was decaying. Her hand flew to her chest again, feeling the cuts on her skin. They burned now, as if the wound were fresh, still open. She recoiled, her pulse quickening. "No, I can't see a doctor," Sarah said, almost desperately. "They'll think I'm crazy. They'll think I'm just imagining things. But I swear, something is wrong. Something is wrong with me. Sarah." "I'll figure it out," she interrupted, her voice shaky but resolute. "I'll get to the bottom of this. I have to. Please, don't tell anyone, okay? I need time to understand what's going on." A hesitant silence followed. Jane knew her too well. She could hear the distress in Sarah's voice and knew it was no use arguing. Finally, Jane sighed. "Okay, but promise me you'll be careful. Promise me you won't let it get worse." "I promise," Sarah said, though she didn't know if she could keep her word. As the day wore on, Sarah tried to keep herself occupied. She went about her routine, made a cup of coffee, checked her emails, tried to act normal, but it was impossible to ignore the sensation that something was pulling her under, bit by bit. The pain in her chest wouldn't go away, and the cuts seemed to be multiplying, spreading out like some grotesque map across her skin. She couldn't even look at herself in the mirror anymore without feeling nauseous, watching as her reflection slowly decayed, piece by piece. But it was the dreams, those dreams, that terrified her the most. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the woman, the faceless figure, the one who had caused the pain in the first place. And each time the woman came closer, her features becoming clearer, sharper, more distinct, until Sarah could finally make out the horrors that lay beneath the surface, the rotting flesh, the hollowed-out eyes, the blood dripping from her skin. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was the nightmares bleeding through, spilling over into her waking world. And it wasn't just Sarah. The woman was reaching out to Jane too. The woman, the thing in her dreams, was calling them both, pulling them towards something dark, something horrible. Sarah was sinking into it, and there was no way out. No way out. She could feel it closing in, the edges of her mind fraying, the truth slipping further and further away with each passing hour. That evening, when Sarah finally returned home after a long day, there was a message waiting for her on her phone. It was from Jane, but there was an unfamiliar tone in her voice. "Sarah," Jane began, her voice trembling. I don't know what's happening. I keep hearing whispers, like someone is standing right behind me. It's like I'm being followed. And last night, I saw it. I saw the thing in your dream, standing at the foot of my bed. It looked like you, but it was different. It wasn't you. Sarah, it was coming for me." A shudder ran through Sarah's entire body, her chest tightening. Jane wasn't safe. And neither was she. The woman, the thing that haunted their dreams, wasn't just watching them. It was drawing them in, piece by piece. And Sarah was afraid it was already too late to stop it. The dreams, the reflections, the wounds, they were all part of the same thing. And if she didn't find out what that thing wanted, she was certain it would be the end of everything. For both of them. The night was thick with dread as Sarah paced the floor of her apartment. The air was oppressive, a heavy silence settling in, broken only by the occasional hum of the refrigerator or the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. It was just past midnight, but she couldn't sleep, not with the feeling of something following her every movement. Something watching. She had spent the entire evening researching anything that could explain what was happening to her. She scoured forums, read articles, even tried to find anything resembling her dreams or her reflections online, but all she found were dead ends. No one had ever written about an experience like this. No one had ever woken up with wounds that didn't belong to the waking world. No one had ever seen their reflection age in front of them. Not like this. She kept thinking about Jane's words. It looks like you, but it's not you. What did that mean? The notion that something, or someone, was wearing her skin haunted her. And the thing that she'd seen in the reflection, was it real? Was it a part of her mind breaking down? Or was it something else altogether? The doorbell rang, a sharp, intrusive sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Sarah froze, her pulse spiking. Who could be at her door at this hour? Her hand instinctively went to her phone, checking the time. 12:15 a.m. too late for anyone to be visiting. She cautiously approached the door, her fingers gripping the handle. Her mind raced. What if it was Jane? What if something had happened to her? What if the nightmares had followed her too? When she opened the door, there was no one there, just the hallway outside, empty and dimly lit by the faint glow of a street lamp coming through the window. But just as she was about to close the door, a small envelope slipped under it. No one had left it, yet somehow it was there, resting on the floor as though it had appeared out of thin air. She bent down to pick it up, her fingers trembling. There was no address, no name, just a single word scrawled across the front in jagged, uneven letters. Help. With a growing sense of unease, Sarah opened the envelope, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside, she found a single sheet of paper, wrinkled, creased as though it had been folded and refolded 100 times. The words written on it were simple, but chilling. The thing that haunts your dreams is real. It feeds on your fear. It wants your body. The reflections don't lie, Sarah. You are already changing. There is no escape from it. You must stop looking into the mirrors. The message was scrawled hastily, but the urgency in it was undeniable. The ink seemed smeared, as if someone had written it under duress, or maybe even while being pursued. The warning sent a chill down her spine. The thing in her reflection, it wasn't just an illusion. It was real. She felt the weight of the words pressing against her, suffocating her. She glanced at the mirror in the hallway, the same one she'd passed countless times before, but now it seemed to loom over her like a predator. Stop looking into the mirrors. But how could she? The mirrors had become her only connection to the truth, the only way to measure how far she'd fallen into the madness. She had to look, had to confirm what was happening, even if it meant losing herself in the process. The wounds on her chest were pulsing again, the throbbing ache like a reminder of something dark and malicious that was crawling under her skin. She shivered at the thought of what might be happening to her. What was she becoming? Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, quick and sharp, like the sound of nails on wood. Sarah's heart leaped into her throat. She didn't want to open the door this time. She couldn't. But she had no choice. This time, when Sarah opened the door, it wasn't Jane. Instead, standing in the threshold was a figure, cloaked in shadows. The shape was indistinct, like a person caught in a fog, their features blurred and shifting. The only thing Sarah could make out clearly was a pair of eyes, wide, staring, unblinking. They were watching her. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step forward, and the smell hit Sarah first, a pungent, foul odor like decaying meat mixed with something metallic. It was so overpowering that she gagged, stepping back involuntarily. The figure's eyes never left her. With a sudden burst of courage, Sarah slammed the door shut, the force echoing through the apartment. Her heart thudded against her chest as she leaned against the door, trying to steady her breath. The figure, the thing, was still there. She could feel it, even through the door. It was real. It was here. But Sarah couldn't bring herself to open the door again. She couldn't. Not after seeing those eyes that were full of hunger. A chill ran through her as she backed away from the door, only to turn and find herself face to face with the mirror once again. The reflection staring back at her was older, so much older now. Her skin had become more drawn, the lines more prominent. But the reflection's eyes were different, darker. She reached out, drawn to it, despite the warning, despite the terror gnawing at her. Her fingers made contact with the cold glass, and for a moment, she saw something behind her. The shadow of the figure, the thing, looming in the reflection. It wasn't supposed to be there. It shouldn't have been. But the reflection moved before she could pull away. It wasn't her. It wasn't her at all. She screamed. The room spun as Sarah staggered back, her vision blurring. She felt like she was sinking into the floor, falling deeper and deeper into something that she couldn't escape. Her mind was unraveling. The lines between dream and reality, reflection and substance, were blurring beyond recognition. Her phone rang again. This time, it was Jane. Sarah? Sarah, are you there? I've seen it again. That thing. It's in my apartment. Jane's voice cracked, cutting off in a gasp. Sarah, it's coming for me. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. I can't, Sarah started, her voice strangled by panic. I can't help you, Jane. I don't know how to stop it. It's everywhere. It's inside me. It's inside you, too. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Jane finally whispered, "Then we'll face it together." But Sarah wasn't so sure. Not anymore. As she looked into the mirror one last time, her reflection smiled at her, the thing that was wearing her skin. And she knew, deep down, that whatever this was, it was never going to let go. The nightmare had already begun. The air in Sarah's apartment was thick with dread, her breath shallow and uneven. Her hand trembled as she held her phone, still pressed to her ear, but Jane's voice had gone silent. There was no more frantic pleading, no more warnings. Only an unbearable quiet. The reflection in the mirror remained unchanged, its features now grotesque in their age, the skin sagging, the eyes darkened with something more than malice. The thing that wore her face, her skin, stood there, unmoving, staring back at her. It was her, but it wasn't. Sarah wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt cemented to the floor. The glass seemed to pull at her, pulling her deeper into the dark chasm of what she had become. What she was becoming. The wounds on her body, deep cuts, burns, and bruises, had continued to bleed through the night, even though they should have healed hours ago. The blood, sticky and thick, seeped through her clothes, staining her hands, the sheets, and the floor beneath her. It wasn't normal. Nothing about this was normal. Suddenly, the phone crackled with static, and Jane's voice broke through the line, ragged and desperate. Sarah, it's inside my apartment now. I can't see it anymore, but I can feel it. Sarah clutched the phone tighter. Her mind was spiraling, caught between the fear of what was happening to her and the overwhelming urge to understand. What was the thing in the mirror? What was it really? Jane, she started, her voice trembling. Jane, It's already inside me too. I think it's coming for you, for both of us. We've become part of it. There's no escaping it. It feeds on us, on our fear, on the reflections. A heavy silence stretched between them. For a long moment, there was no sound except for the faint hum of the phone, the static swirling in the background like the whispers of something unseen. Then, Jane's voice came through, barely audible. I think it wants more than us, Sarah. I think it wants our souls. Sarah's heart lurched. Her soul. Could this thing, whatever it was, truly take that? Was it not just feeding on their fear, but on their very essence? Could it consume them completely? The phone line crackled again, and before Sarah could speak, Jane's voice faltered, then was swallowed by an eerie silence. Her call had dropped. Sarah felt cold. So cold. She turned to face the mirror once again, the reflection growing more and more monstrous with each passing second. The thing that wore her face grinned, its teeth yellow and sharp, the skin stretched tight over the bones of a face that no longer seemed to belong to her. The wounds on Sarah's body, on the reflection's body, looked worse, as though they were spreading like an infection. Sarah reached out, instinctively, her fingers trembling as they touched the cold glass once more. It was calling her. She could feel it, a pull deeper than gravity, deeper than reason. Her reflection reached back, its hand pressing against the glass on the other side, as though it wanted to reach through to her, to pull her into its world. The thing smiled wider, its expression predatory. You're mine now, it whispered, but the words weren't from the reflection. They came from somewhere deeper, from within her own mind. You've always been mine. Her breath quickened. Was it her mind breaking? Was she losing herself to the nightmare? She didn't know anymore. She couldn't tell what was real, what was just a dream, or whether she was still in one. But one thing became clear, she had to escape. She tore her eyes from the mirror, her reflection still grinning behind her as she ran to the door. Her body felt heavy, like a weight was pulling her down, dragging her into the darkness. But she couldn't stay in the apartment. She couldn't stay in this house, this prison of nightmares. She burst out into the hallway, her feet slamming against the wooden floor with each frantic step. The lights flickered above her, casting long, menacing shadows along the walls. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of wind felt like something was closing in around her. Suddenly, a cold hand clutched her arm. She spun around to find nothing there, just an empty, dark hallway. The air was thick with something more than fear. It felt like an oppressive force, something ancient, something that had been waiting. And then the mirror at the end of the hallway that had never been there before, came into view. Its glass was dark, the surface rippling like water. The thing inside it wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was reaching out. A shadow twisted across the floor, creeping up her legs, seeping into her skin, pulling at her very essence. Her vision swam. She couldn't breathe. The thing's voice echoed in her mind, soft but insistent, like a whisper right behind her ear. You're mine. Her reflection stepped out of the mirror, no longer contained by the glass. It was free now, and it wasn't alone. Sarah stumbled backward, but her feet didn't move. She couldn't run anymore. The shadow reached out for her, wrapping around her legs like chains, binding her in place. Her body screamed to break free, but it was too late. The thing had already claimed her. Her reflection, her own face, was twisted into something unrecognizable, and yet, at the same time, it was hers. "You've always been mine," the thing repeated, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "You were never meant to be anything more than a shadow of me. I am you. I always have been." Sarah screamed as the darkness overtook her. She wanted to fight, wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. The mirror, the thing in the mirror, had already consumed her. Her eyes shut tight, and she could feel herself being pulled into the blackness. She couldn't hold on any longer. She could hear Jane's voice now, distant, but full of the same terror she had felt all along. But it was too late for both of them. In the final, fleeting moment before everything went black, Sarah saw her reflection one last time. It was smiling, and it was hers. She was gone. The apartment was silent again. The mirror, now still and untouched, reflected nothing but the dark, empty hallway. The bloodstains on the floor had disappeared, leaving no trace of what had happened. Everything was as it should be, except for the faintest, almost imperceptible grin that lingered in the reflection. It was a reflection that would never age. And as the clock ticked on, one thing became painfully clear. The nightmare would never end. It was already beginning again. Story 4. No one who visited Henry Weaver's modest suburban home ever really thought it was unusual. There was nothing striking about the house itself, just a quiet, red brick affair with a garden that could use a little more care, but otherwise, it blended into the neighborhood like any other. But if you asked Henry what drew him to this particular house, it wasn't the quaintness, nor the cozy little yard that caught his attention. It was the collection. As a self-proclaimed antique collector, Henry prided himself on his knowledge of the rare and the macabre. He had bookshelves lined with texts about forgotten relics, ancient furniture, and the eerie objects that seemed to carry with them a life of their own. For years, he had scoured estate sales, yard sales, even dark corners of antique stores, looking for pieces that spoke to him. It was during one such hunt that he found her. The doll. The day he walked into Mrs. Barrett's estate sale, he had been expecting nothing more than a few porcelain figurines and dusty old chairs. What he found, however, was an item that made his heart skip. A doll. Not just any doll, no. A strange one. It was a doll that seemed old. Older than anything Henry had ever seen. Its face, though painted in the traditional rosy cheek fashion, had a certain lifelike quality to it that unsettled him. The porcelain of the skin was so smooth it almost looked real, and its glass eyes were dark, too dark, like pools of ink, unblinking and full of secrets. Henry stood before it, mesmerized by the doll's unnerving gaze. Her clothes, faded dress of ivory lace, looked to have been made a century ago, and the tiny bonnet she wore framed her face with an eerie softness. As he picked her up, he felt a coldness emanate from the porcelain, a chill that seemed to seep into his skin. The air around him felt still, as if the room held its breath. Interesting choice, Mrs. Barrett's voice startled him. I had hoped someone would take her. Henry, still holding the doll, nodded slowly. How much for her? Mrs. Barrett's lips curled into a smile. A fair price, given her history. But be warned, she's not like the others. The words hung in the air, cryptic and unsettling. Yet Henry, who had seen his fair share of oddities in his years of collecting, brushed it off with a half smile. "I'm used to strange things. Just take good care of her," Mrs. Barrett said softly, her eyes glinting with something that Henry couldn't quite place. They tend to move when you're not looking." Henry chuckled, assuming it was just an old woman's superstition. He had heard his share of stories about haunted dolls, but none of them had ever managed to shake his resolve. For him, there was no such thing as superstition. He wasn't some scared child, terrified of things that went bump in the night. He was a collector, a man who appreciated history, no matter how unsettling it might be. He paid the woman, took the doll home, and placed it gently on the mantelpiece, where it would sit as just another object in his ever-growing collection. The first few days were uneventful. The doll sat on the mantelpiece, as still and lifeless as any other antique in his home. Henry didn't think much of it, even though his mind often wandered back to the strange feeling the doll had given him. He would occasionally glance up at it, but it was nothing more than an eerie presence, like a forgotten memory that wouldn't go away. But one night, as he sat reading in his favorite chair, he noticed something that made the hairs on his neck stand up. The doll had moved. It wasn't much at first, just a slight shift in its position. The doll, which had been facing forward when Henry had last looked at it, was now turned slightly to the right, its head tilted in his direction. A chill ran through him, but he shrugged it off. The house had its quirks, settling sounds, the occasional draft, but nothing to suggest that something sinister was at play. Maybe he had moved it himself, he thought, but that didn't sit right with him. He had specifically left it in its place after admiring it the day before. The next night, as he sat at the same chair, the doll had moved again. This time, its head was turned sharply to the left, its eyes locked on him. His stomach dropped. Henry stood up, walking over to the mantelpiece, trying to force himself to think logically. He hadn't moved the doll, but it had moved. As the days went on, the movements of the doll became more pronounced. Sometimes it would be facing one direction when he left the room, only to find it turn another way when he returned. Other times, it would be leaning slightly forward, its delicate porcelain hands outstretched, as though it was about to speak or reach for him. At night, he started hearing faint sounds, the creak of its legs on the wooden surface, the soft scrape of its clothes shifting. The house was old, but these noises felt different. They weren't the usual sounds of settling beams or creaking floorboards. These sounds had a deliberate, purposeful quality to them, like the slow movements of something that had been waiting for a long time. Henry began to question his sanity. Was he losing his mind? He told himself that he must be. It was just a doll, after all, porcelain, lifeless. Yet, every time he turned his back, it seemed to inch closer to him, like a shadow coming alive. One night, as the clock ticked past midnight, Henry found himself staring at the doll from his chair, an unease creeping up his spine. He couldn't take his eyes off it. That's when he saw it. A small but unmistakable shift, a subtle movement of the doll's arms. He swore he saw its fingers twitch, its hand moving just slightly toward the edge of the mantelpiece. The hair on his arm stood on end as the room fell silent. His heart raced. For the first time, a flicker of true terror crept into his chest. He stood up, his breath coming in sharp gasps. It's not possible, he thought, but he couldn't ignore what he had seen. The The doll was no longer just an object in his collection. It was alive, in some way, moving, shifting, watching. Henry could feel the weight of its eyes on him, even as he walked out of the room, unable to tear his gaze away from the doll. His pulse quickened. What was happening to him? He had to figure it out. But was he truly ready to face the truth of what he had brought into his home? Henry couldn't shake the sensation that the doll was watching him. It was a feeling that had started as a whisper, a trickle of unease creeping into the back of his mind. But now, it had grown into something far more palpable, something impossible to ignore. His eyes would dart to the doll every time he entered the room, scanning it for any movement, any change. At first, it was subtle. The doll's head would tilt just a little more than it had before. The hands would inch closer to the edge of the mantelpiece, as if reaching out to him. He could swear that sometimes, when he looked at it, its eyes seemed to glimmer, reflecting the light in unnatural ways. But it wasn't until that night, when the doll actually moved, that Henry understood the horror he was truly dealing with. He had been sitting in his study, the door to the living room left slightly ajar. The doll had been placed in its usual spot on the mantel, its porcelain face staring blankly ahead. Henry had tried to focus on his work, but the thought of the doll kept gnawing at him. Finally, after hours of trying to ignore it, he stood up from his desk and walked into the other room. What he saw made his blood run cold. The doll wasn't facing him anymore. In fact, it wasn't facing forward at all. The doll had moved, its head turned toward the wall, its arms raised as if frozen in mid-motion. It looked as though it had been caught mid-step, a gesture of motion that wasn't possible for an inanimate object. Henry stood in the doorway, his breath shallow. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. He just stared at the doll, hoping against hope that it was some trick of his mind. But the longer he stared, the more he saw. The doll wasn't just tilted, it had been moved. Its body was shifted, angled in such a way that the illusion of movement was undeniable. And yet, no one had been in the room. The air felt heavier in that moment, as though the house itself were holding its breath. He backed away slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he turned to leave, he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks, the softest, faintest sound, a whisper. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a phrase. But it was there. In the silence of the room, the air itself seemed to whisper. Henry didn't wait around to figure out what it was. He fled to the kitchen, where he poured himself a glass of water, his hands trembling. This can't be happening, he thought. He wasn't a superstitious man. He wasn't the kind of person who would fall for tales of haunted dolls or cursed antiques. But that was before the doll had begun to move. Now, as the hours ticked on, Henry couldn't help but wonder if Mrs. Barrett had known something he didn't. Her warning about the doll, they tend to move when you're not looking, came back to him, echoing in his mind like a death knell. Had he been warned, and had he ignored it? The answers, he realized with dawning horror, were becoming less clear with every passing minute. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Henry tossed and turned, plagued by a restless mind. His thoughts kept returning to the doll, its eyes, its unnerving stillness, and the way it had moved. It was too much for his rational mind to process. It was a doll. Porcelain, lifeless, cold. It couldn't move. But then, as the night deepened, the sleep that eventually claimed him was a fractured, disjointed thing. He awoke again and again, drenched in sweat, but with only fragmented memories of strange, vivid dreams. In those dreams, the doll was alive, but more than that, it was reaching for him, following him, chasing him through the corridors of his own mind. Each time Henry woke, he felt an oppressive weight on his chest, as though the doll's presence had followed him even into the dream world. He could almost feel the touch of its cold porcelain fingers, its unblinking eyes fixed on him. The worst part, however, was that it felt real. Too real. At dawn, Henry sat up in his bed, his sheets tangling around his legs. His breath was ragged, his body drenched in sweat. For a moment, he lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to gather his thoughts. It's just a dream, he told himself. Just a dream. But when he finally dared to open his eyes, there was a new sensation, something strange that was impossible to ignore. The wounds. It wasn't the kind of thing he noticed immediately. At first, when Henry swung his legs off the bed and stood up, there was nothing. No pain, no sign that anything was wrong. But then, as he stretched and went to the bathroom, he saw them. Tiny scratches. It wasn't much, just small, thin lines of red, like paper cuts. They were scattered across his arms, his legs, his neck. But they were there, undeniable, like something had scratched him in the night. But no! Nothing had touched him. Nothing had been in the room with him. He was certain of it. He leaned closer to the mirror, running his fingers over the marks. His skin felt warm to the touch, and his pulse quickened. The more he looked, the more he became convinced that these weren't just normal scratches. These were deliberate. These were like the doll's fingers. The realization hit him like a freight train. It wasn't a dream. Something had scratched him. Something had marked him. And it wasn't just any scratch. It was the same feeling, the same coldness, the same eerie sensation that he had felt the first time he touched the doll. He turned sharply, expecting to see the doll sitting innocently on the mantelpiece as it had every day. But when he glanced toward the living room, he saw that it had changed again. The doll was no longer facing forward. It was turned toward the hallway now, its head turned in such a way that its eyes were fixed directly on him. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He could have sworn that, just minutes ago, it had been facing the other way. He didn't know if he was imagining things anymore, or if the doll was truly moving on its own. And that's when he heard again, the whisper. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but there. It was a voice now, too soft to understand, but with a tone that seemed to echo through his very bones. Come closer. Henry froze, the words like a jolt of electricity to his nervous system. His mind screamed at him to leave the house, to run away and never look back. But his legs betrayed him, inching forward, unwillingly drawn toward the living room. Each step felt like it took an eternity. The air grew colder the closer he got. The doll was still there, watching him, its eyes unblinking, its fingers still stretched out toward him. His pulse thundered in his ears as he reached the mantelpiece and stood in front of the doll. I'm not crazy, he thought. This is real. But the moment he reached out to touch the doll, the world seemed to tilt and everything went dark. When Henry woke, he didn't know where he was at first. His head was foggy, his vision blurred. The cold was biting at his skin, sharp and cruel. His hands were trembling uncontrollably, and his entire body felt like it was suspended in a dream that couldn't end. He pushed himself up slowly, the world around him spinning as he tried to orient himself. How long had he been out? He glanced around the room, his living room, disoriented but, to his relief, still intact. The walls were the same, the furniture in place, nothing out of the ordinary, except for one thing. The doll. It was standing now. No longer sitting on the mantel, it had climbed down and was now positioned upright, its tiny, delicate hands outstretched as if begging for attention. Its porcelain face was as expressionless as ever, but the sight of it standing sent a cold wave of panic through Henry's chest. He rubbed his eyes, hoping that the fog in his mind was playing tricks on him. But no, the doll had moved again. It was standing. He tried to breathe through the panic rising in his throat, his mouth dry and numb. It was just a doll, he told himself. A doll. That's all it was. But the whisper in his mind grew louder, the feeling of being watched more pressing. It was not just a doll. The doll was something else, something alive, something sinister. Henry staggered to his feet and rushed out of the room. He needed air. He needed space. He needed to be away from that thing. The cool morning air outside did little to calm the deep, gnawing terror that had taken root in him. The sun was only beginning to rise, casting long, early morning shadows across his front yard. He stood there, breathing deeply, trying to gather his thoughts. But it wasn't enough. He could still feel the weight of the doll's gaze on him, burning into the back of his skull. It was then that he remembered Mrs. Barrett. He had almost forgotten about her cryptic warning about the doll lingering at the edges of his mind like a fleeting dream. They tend to move when you're not looking. Those words circled back to him, a chilling reminder of the inexplicable events he was experiencing. Perhaps she knew something more about the doll than she had let on. Henry didn't waste any time. He drove to her house, feeling a surge of desperation with every passing mile. Mrs. Barrett had been an antique dealer for decades. She must have known something about the doll, its history, why it was acting the way it was. When he arrived at her house, he didn't wait for an invitation. He knocked urgently, his fist pounding the door. Mrs. Barrett opened it after a few moments, looking at him with raised eyebrows. "Henry?" she asked, surprise in her voice. "What's going on?" He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "It's the doll. The one I bought from you. It moves. It changes position while I'm not looking at it. And last night, I woke up with wounds on my body. Just like in my dreams. What's happening? What did I buy from you?" Mrs. Barrett's face hardened. She didn't speak immediately, but her eyes seemed to flicker with recognition, almost a moment of fear. "Come inside," she said finally, her voice low. Once inside, she led him to a small sitting room, a space filled with old books and trinkets from across the globe. She motioned for him to sit down, and then, after a moment's hesitation, she began to speak. "I've seen this before," she said quietly. "I was hoping you wouldn't find out. I didn't think you would take the doll seriously enough, but you've woken it now." Henry's heart raced. "What do you mean, woken it?" Mrs. Barrett sighed deeply, her eyes downcast. "That doll. It's not just an antique. It's a vessel. An anchor for presence. It's been in my family for generations. There are stories, old stories, about how it moves on its own, how it gets into the minds of those who possess it. It's never been this bad before. Henry's mind raced, the pieces falling into place with terrifying clarity. You mean it's cursed? She nodded grimly. Curse it, yes. But worse than that, it feeds on fear, on the energy of the one who owns it. Over time, it takes more from you, your sanity, your will. It pulls you into its world, and soon you become part of it. Henry's blood ran cold. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move. His mind refused to accept what she was saying, but everything about the doll, the scratches on his body, the dreams, the whispers, pointed to something darker, something otherworldly. Can you help me? He whispered, his voice trembling. Mrs. Barrett's face softened, but there was no hope in her eyes. I can't help you now. Once it's begun, there's no stopping it. Henry returned to his house in a daze, the weight of Mrs. Barrett's words crushing in with every step. His mind spun in endless loops, each thought more horrifying than the last. There's no stopping it. He stumbled through his front door, his gaze immediately drawn to the living room. The doll was still there, sitting innocently on the mantel. It almost looked like it was waiting for him. But that was the problem. It wasn't waiting. It was alive. He tried to ignore the cold shiver running down his spine, but the doll's presence was undeniable. He approached it slowly, his hand shaking, every nerve in his body screaming for him to stop. But he couldn't stop. He had to know what was happening. As he reached the mantel, the air grew heavy, suffocating. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes watching him. He leaned in, his fingers hovering above the doll, but before he could make contact, it happened again. The whisper. This time, it was louder, clearer. Come closer. Henry recoiled, his breath coming in shallow gasps. This isn't real. It couldn't be. But the whisper came again, insistent, familiar. Come closer, Henry. Come closer and you'll understand. Something inside him snapped. Without thinking, he reached out to touch the doll's porcelain head, his fingers brushing against the cold surface. And then everything went black. When Henry awoke again, the world felt wrong. He wasn't in his living room anymore. The walls were dark, suffocating, closing in on him. He couldn't see much in the pitch blackness, but he felt it, a presence, something watching him, just out of reach. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even breathe properly. The air was thick with a low, guttural hum, a sound that vibrated through his bones. And then he heard it, a soft, deliberate sound of porcelain scraping against the floor. You came closer. Now, you will never leave. The voice was low and impossibly close, yet Henry couldn't find the strength to move, to fight, to scream. And then he saw it. The doll, standing in the corner of the room, its unblinking eyes fixed on him, its mouth curled into an eerie smile. You stay with me now. Forever. Henry woke again, but this time, the feeling was different. There was no cold sweat, no panic-fueled gasp. He had no immediate sense of being disoriented. Instead, he felt strangely calm. His eyes opened, and for a moment, he didn't recognize the space around him. The walls were dark, as though a shadow had descended and plumbed everything. There were no windows, no light, just the suffocating weight of the dark that seemed to press against his chest. The doll was in the corner of the room. But it wasn't just in the corner. It was now directly in front of him, sitting on a wooden chair, staring into his eyes with its glassy, lifeless eyes. The sight of it did nothing to startle him. In fact, it felt almost welcoming. "Do you understand now, Henry?" the voice whispered. It was a soft, melodic sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The voice filled the room with an unsettling sense of familiarity, an old friend come to call, but one that was now far too dangerous. Henry blinked, his mind struggling to grasp what was happening. Was this a dream? Was it real? "Do you want to leave?" the voice purred. It was as though the doll was speaking through him, building itself into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, controlling them. "Leave?" Henry's voice cracked, but he barely recognized it. He tried to stand, but his body was sluggish, almost as if it were fighting him. When he looked down, he saw that his legs were chained, though he had no memory of how they had come to be bound. "No one leaves once they've touched me," the doll said. It was unnervingly calm, but there was a finality in its tone. It wasn't asking, it was telling him. Henry's hands clenched into fists, his skin crawling with an unnatural coldness. "Why me?" he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of the question. "Why is this happening?" There was a pause, long and drawn out. Then, the voice, calm as ever, answered him. "Because you wanted to understand. You wanted the truth. And the truth comes at a price." A deep, cold laugh echoed through the room, and the shadows seemed to dance around him, pressing closer, suffocating him. The doll moved then, ever so slightly. It tilted its head, as if it were considering Henry, laying him against some unseen scale. "But you're not just here for knowledge, are you?" "No, you are here for something else." The shadows thickened and flickered, like a storm about to break. The room seemed to pulse with the weight of something ancient, something vast. The doll wasn't just a collector's item. It was a doorway, a living portal between realms, drawing Henry in. Henry gasped, his chest heaving. A doorway? A part of him, the part that was still clinging to the shred of sanity he had left, wanted to reject it. He wanted to scream, to run, to tear his way out of his nightmare. But there was something else, something dark and curious, gnawing at his insides. He had always prided himself on his ability to understand, to dissect the unknown and make sense of it. But this was beyond understanding. "Who are you?" Henry croaked, straining against the chains that bound him. "What are you?" The doll did not answer immediately. It simply sat there, watching him with those empty, glass eyes. It was almost as if it was deciding how much of the truth it was willing to share. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you," it said finally, its voice now colder, its words cutting through the thick air. "But you will learn, Henry. You'll learn soon enough." And then the shadows shifted again. The room seemed to distort and warp, like something was being peeled away, layer by layer. The walls, once so solid, felt like they were no longer there. They rippled like water, and in their place, cold emptiness stretched out. Henry tried to scream, but no sound came from his throat. Where was he? His hands, still chained to the chair, began to burn with a strange heat, as if something was pulling at him from the inside out. The doll's mouth opened. It didn't speak, but Henry heard it, the unmistakable hiss of something ancient, something alive. "I warned you, Henry," it said, its voice now filled with malice. "This is the price. You wanted to see. Now, you'll be part of me." A sharp pain shot through his body. It was as if his skin were being torn from the inside, his flesh twisting with unseen hands, his very soul being peeled away. It was all happening too fast. He couldn't move, couldn't resist. The pain was unbearable, but something worse was happening. It wasn't just his body that was being ravaged. His mind was breaking. In the distance, through the fog of his fractured thoughts, he could hear whispers. Thousands of voices, calling his name, begging for his attention. They were coming from the doll, from the shadows, from everywhere. "No!" Henry gasped, his throat raw, his mind spiraling. "No, please, stop." The doll laughed again, low, guttural. The sound twisted through Henry's mind like a jagged blade. The pain surged again, and Henry felt something inside him snap. He was no longer a person. He was something else. With a sudden jerk, Henry felt the chains fall away. His body moved without him commanding it, and he stood before the doll, eyes wide, unable to comprehend what was happening. His hands were no longer his own. They were cold, pale, and rigid, just like the doll's. His fingers curled, and he could feel them growing stiff, moving with mechanical precision. "Welcome to my world, Henry," the doll whispered. "You belong to me now." He wanted to scream, but no sound came. His voice was gone, taken, just like his body, twisted into something else. The doll, it had won. As his mind faded, he realized that he was becoming the doll. The vessel. The doll's laugh echoed around him, filling the dark space with the promise of eternal torment. Henry had become part of it, a part of its cursed existence. He was no longer Henry. The man he had been was lost, swallowed up in the void. And the worst part? He could hear himself whispering the same words over and over again. "I belong to you now."